Evan Frendo here. In this session, I'd like to look at materials. In other words, the materials we use to teach business English. We'll be looking at 4 different types in this session. First of all, we'll talk about published materials. So these are the course books and the resource books and so on that are produced by big publishers, small publishers all over the world. Then we'll be looking at authentic materials, what we mean by authentic materials and how we can use them. We'll be looking at framework materials, and then finally we'll look at tailor-made or bespoke materials. And throughout this session, what we'll be looking at is the advantages and disadvantages of each type. Let's start with published materials and course books, which are probably the most well-known. Course books, well, you find them everywhere. They're normally produced by big publishers for a global market. They tend to focus on general business English because they're not specific to a particular company or context. They're aimed very often at pre-experienced as well as in-work learners. In other words, trying to open up to as wide an audience as possible. They come in many levels, multi-level, so a typical course might be written for a beginner, intermediate, advanced, and so on. And they tend to come in packages with a lot of supplementary material attached. So there'll be a teacher's book, there'll be workbooks, videos, audio, internet pages, and so on and so on and so on. So a big package of very useful general business English material. Another published material, of course, is more specific, English for specific purposes, we could call it. And these tend to focus on one area, and in our terms, one area of business English. So if you look at the examples in the picture, we have an English for management book written for the Chinese market. We have a book on the language of international negotiations. We have a listening skills book, we have an email book, and we have a book which works on helping people know how to use the English for working virtually. There are thousands of these sorts of books out there on the market. And then finally, there are resource books. Resource books are all the others, which are just really, you could call them supplementary material to a main course. Sometimes they are the main course. It depends on the course and its aims and objectives. In the picture here, you can see some photocopyable worksheets. You can see a grammar book. You can see a vocabulary book, dictionary, of course. You can see a book specifically designed to help somebody pass a business English test. And you've got other books full of activities which can be photocopied or which can be adapted for use in your classroom. Fantastic resource books. What are the advantages and disadvantages of published materials? Well, the advantages, first of all, is that they save time. They're ready to go. You just pay your money and off you go. They have a solid structure, a solid framework, and a consistent layout, so they're easy to follow, and you can go from Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, and it's all the same type of thing. People know what to expect. They tend to be written by experienced authors, experienced teams of authors and teams of editors and so on behind the scenes. They look professional, they feel good, they look as if they've spent some money on them. You know, the artwork is good, they've been proofread properly and so on. And relatively speaking, they are cheap. As we will see when we compare them to other types of materials, especially tailor-made materials, a course book is a low cost for what you get. However, there are disadvantages, of course. They may not be relevant, and in business English we know that there's a continuum of types of business English classes, and in some classes they will just not be relevant because people want very specific things for a particular context. They can date quickly, of course, depending on the topics and the information inside. But as new technology comes in, new ways of communicating comes in, an older book will not have these. An example of this is how telephones have developed over the years. If you look at a book 5 or 10 years ago, the phones people are using are completely different to the smartphones we use now. And smartphones we use now will be completely different to whatever is coming in 10 years' time. They may use an inappropriate methodology for your own particular teaching context. Some cultures, some companies, some schools have particular ways, preferred ways of teaching and learning, But a book, of course, is set and ready to go. And of course, they are adaptable, but sometimes they will make assumptions about the way people learn, which you may not agree with. There is a lot of criticism in the literature, in the academic literature, about published materials, and that is that often they're not based on real research. They're based more on intuition. So people haven't analyzed exactly what is said in meetings. They have intuitively written down exercises and activities which correspond roughly to what they think happens in meetings. And so really, in a sense, published materials are a compromise. They're a compromise between the publisher, the teacher, and the learner, and their different needs. They will not be perfect for any one of those groups, but it's a compromise and a very nice package. And many teachers all over the world, many learners all over the world use and love their published materials. The next type I'd like to look at is authentic materials. Now, authentic materials, this can be quite a complex term to delve into, but for the purposes of this video, I'd like to define authentic materials as basically materials which have not been written or designed for the language training classroom. They are just materials which have come out from the real world, as it were, and are brought into the classroom and then can be adapted, or they can be exploited according to the needs of the trainer and the learners. And here's a typical type of authentic material. It's taken out from a particular context, and as you can see, it has abbreviations, it has terminology, etc., which not everybody will understand and will never need to understand because it's very specific. So we can have signposts from a building site here, or diagrams of a technical process or a product. It can be anything. The wonderful thing about authentic materials, if you can bring them into the classroom, is that they offer real language and content. They are exactly the language which is used in the workplace. And so if you have the authentic material for the right class, the right group of learners, they can be incredibly motivating and very relevant, because the learners know that that's exactly the sort of language they need to be able to use and can identify with it. But of course, these authentic materials can be very specific. I'm sure unless you happen to have classes which really need these three things, you will never use these three types of authentic materials. Very often they need adapting because they're not ready to go in the classroom. You may want to supplement it by adding extra materials. You may want to change some things. So they're not ready to go very often. And sometimes there are confidentiality or copyright issues. You can't just help yourself to stuff from the real world, bring it into the classroom without getting permission from the owners and making sure that you follow the rules about how the owners want that material to be used. So that's, in some contexts, can be quite critical. Let's look at framework materials now. That's our third type of materials for this video. Framework materials are basically diagrams, diagrammatic forms of very simple language, like you can see here, which are used to exploit, to get people in the classroom to talk, to communicate with each other about specific topics, specific issues relevant to their own workplace. They tend to be very simple, like this, and they can be used to initiate, to trigger discussions on a particular subject. So here you can see a framework for recent meetings. You could use this in any classroom in the world. You could go in to any in-company classroom, that is, give this to your students, to your learners, and say, think about these, your last meeting, a recent meeting, who was there, where was it, what was it, how did it happen, when, and so on. And then get people to talk about it. So you might start off this session with some sort of brainstorming of meetings vocabulary. Then you could give out this framework, get people to make notes about it individually. Then they can form pairs and discuss it and share ideas, perhaps swap pairs again and chair again, and then at the end present to the classroom on their recent meeting, maybe a 3, 4, 5 minute presentation. The key thing with these framework materials is after the students or the learners have done their presentation or their discussion, that gives the trainer the chance to give very specific language feedback on what was said during the conversation. So the feedback can be very tailor-made. Here's another one. I use this all the time. I just ask people in the classroom to draw a process. And off they go. They all draw a process about their own particular workplace, their own particular department, and do a short 3, 4, 5 minute presentation on the process. What's interesting here is not only do people practice the language of explaining their own processes, which is something very often they need to be able to do with clients, with customers, with visitors, but the other people in the class are actually very interested in what happens in the other department or in the other company and so on. And so people debate and discuss and really communicate about the topic which is being discussed, which is being presented. So if we look at these framework materials, what are the advantages? Well, first of all, they use the learner as the main resource. This is not the teacher or the trainer or a publisher coming in with the content. The learners are generating the content themselves. The work involved is minimal. They take a few seconds to make. A few seconds. You can draw them up on the board, or you can print them out and give them to people. But it's minimal preparation. They're very, very flexible. You can use them with big groups, small groups, experienced groups, less experienced groups, and so on. They're very, very good for mixed ability classes where people are different levels of language or different experience, because everybody works to their own level as they prepare their own little discussion or presentation. Of course, they're very relevant to the learner's own specific area, and the feedback which the trainer gives, as I said, is specific to the language which was used during the discussion or the presentation. There are disadvantages. The first one, the main one, is that there is no prepared language input. And of course, in a business English classroom, very often the learners don't know the language because that's why they're there. The teacher doesn't necessarily know the language because they're not necessarily part of that industry or insiders in the industry. And so materials which bring the language in can be very useful. And framework materials don't do that. It relies on the people in the room, the learners primarily, producing the target discourse, the target language. And if they can't do it, and the trainer can't do it, then you will not be practicing the language that they need. And of course, they're not appropriate for all business genres. I mean, this sort of exercise is fantastic if you want to have conversations, if you want to have discussions, if you want to have explanations, presentations, but they're not particularly good if you want to do something like practice the language of emailing, for example, in a particular company context, because they're spoken, they're not written. That's one example. So finally, let's move on to tailor-made materials. Tailor-made materials can also be called bespoke materials. In other words, they're materials which you and your writing team perhaps create very specifically for a particular group or particular teaching context. So you can see here a couple of pictures. These are some materials I designed for a particular company. What company do you think needed materials like this? What sort of company would you expect these sorts of materials to be used in? Just pause the video and have a think. Right, well, I hope you've had a look at it. You've probably decided that this is some sort of metal industry, some sort of heavy steel works or something like that. You may not know the words, that's not important, but you can make a guess. But actually, these materials were developed for a group of German software experts, so programmers working on software for a steel mill in Korea. These were IT people. They work in the IT industry. Their English was quite good, but they were moving to a project in Korea. They had to work with a customer, a client in Korea, a steel mill in Korea, and they had to be able to understand the local context, the local language, the customer's processes in order to design the software. So these were IT people, and they had to learn the language of a particular industry which they've never been involved in before in their lives and may never be involved in again. So this is the sort of tailor-made materials. These are materials, there's no course book ready to go on this particular area. There's no framework material you can use because, of course, these people are not able to talk about this sort of target language yet because they don't know it. You can't use authentic materials necessarily because that might be too complicated. If you pull in the real authentic materials from the workplace, it might be too hard. And so you make your own materials. You tailor make according to the needs. Of course, tailor-made materials can be anything. I mean, nowadays it's very easy to use software programs. This is one I use with some colleagues to design some um, learning software for vocabulary at low level. A2 is a beginner level of English. And this is drag and drop type exercises. There were little videos and so on. Very, very simple and easy now to buy a software package and design this sort of material, very, very specific for your particular client or your particular group of learners. The problem, of course, with tailor making is that it takes a lot of time. First of all, you need to do a thorough needs analysis. Now, needs analysis is a key part of any business English training program. It's one of the things that makes business English business English. Here you can see I've written down communication needs, business needs, the teaching needs, pedagogy, and so on. But this takes time. This takes time which you wouldn't necessarily be doing with a course book, because a course book is ready to go and you can pull out and adapt. You'd still need to do a needs analysis, but here you need to start at the beginning, as it were. So you'd be doing things like observing your clients, interviewing people, asking questions written or spoken, even doing task-based assessment, which means giving people the task they will have to do in their future workplace in English and seeing how good they are. So you're understanding their needs. Then you're collecting the resources you need, and this takes a lot of time as well. You're looking at authentic materials, maybe recording some conversations, collecting language samples from the real world of whatever you're creating. You're speaking to the expert insiders, so these are the people in the company who can already use English in this particular context, but they're not coming to your lessons. You're going to be speaking to other trainers, perhaps other learners, all your learners. You're going to be working at your desktop, doing desktop research on your computer. A lot of places you can collect resources, but this takes time. And then finally, once you've collected all that, you're going to be developing the materials. So you'll have to make decisions about the methodology, what is appropriate for your particular group or your particular context. You'd be writing your syllabus with its aims and objectives, in other words, the plan of the course. You'll be designing specific activities which are appropriate to your group. You'd be working on how the materials are going to be evaluated. And so you'll be looking at things like writing the materials, editing the materials, looking at audio, video, artwork, and so on. This all takes time, takes a lot of expertise, and you'll probably be looking at, initially at least, piloting them, which means trying them out on some learners before you use them for real. So these sorts of materials, tailor-made materials, are very relevant. They can be incredibly appropriate for your group because you have designed them for a particular group, but they are expensive. They are very, very time consuming to make, which means they are expensive, and they do require expertise. Just because you're a teacher doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to write materials. There's a lot of expertise required in order to do this stuff. And that brings us to the end of this short video on materials. We've looked at 4 types, all used very commonly by business English teachers all around the world. We've looked at published materials, we've looked at authentic materials, framework materials, and tailor-made or bespoke materials. And I hope you now have a feeling for some of the different types of materials and also their advantages and disadvantages of using them. When we get into the real world of business English, of course, what we need to be able to do is not just know and differentiate between the 4 types, but we need to know about how to select the right materials, how to adapt where necessary, how to supplement or add to these materials, how to design materials where necessary, and of course, how to evaluate our materials. But these are subjects for other videos. So that brings us to the end of our session on materials. I hope you enjoyed it and see you next time. Bye-bye.